Welcome to the listener's commentary on the Old Testament. Your guide is pastor and theologian, Dr. John Whitaker, and the heart behind these studies is to help you better understand the text of Scripture so you can more fully live it out. It's all about helping you learn and live the Bible.
All right, welcome to the book of Exodus here on the listener's commentary. In this recording, I just want to give a little bit of the backstory of the book, some key facts about the history behind the book, as well as an overview of the book so that you have sort of a map as you read through it to kind of hang all the different pieces of the book on. And the reality is that when you sit down to read the book of Exodus, you actually might find it a bit more difficult or challenging to read than Genesis. And Genesis has its own challenges, that's for sure. There is a wide historical and cultural gap between the book of Genesis and today. So it's got its own challenges, but Genesis is still more straightforward and a very engaging narrative. Exodus begins that way as an engaging narrative, but before long in the book of Exodus, you have law codes, ancient Near Eastern law codes, in fact. You have blueprints for the tabernacle, and then you have an record of the construction of the tabernacle, and all of that makes the book of Exodus a challenge to read. So, want to try to help with that by giving a little bit of an introduction and backstory on this recording. Just by way of title, the word Exodus actually is a compound word from two Greek words that means the way out or the way from. And the book of Exodus tells how Israel came out of Egypt, how God led them out from Egypt. So that is what the title means by its very nature. And what we need to remember is Exodus is a continuation of the story that began in Genesis. In fact, it's really important to remember that the whole Torah is one unified story. It tells a composite story over the course of 5 books. When we say Torah, we're talking Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those books tell one story. And so when we come to the book of Exodus, we're picking up to a certain degree where the story left off. And so we need to remember the story that began in Genesis in order to understand where we're at in that story with the book of Exodus. And so if you recall, in the book of Genesis, after the creation account and after the account of Adam and Eve, humankind's rebellion against God, that led to how is God going to solve the problem of sin and death? And God chooses to call a man by the name of Abram, later called Abraham, to whom God makes a promise that through him, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And you watch as the story of Abraham unfolds in the book of Genesis, and God restates that promise multiple times, that your offspring are going to be like the stars of the sky, and through you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And then that promise is passed on to Abraham's son, Isaac. He becomes the heir of the promise, the child of promise, and it's restated to him. And then from Isaac, it's passed on to Jacob, and then Jacob's sons becomes the children of promise. And that's where we pick up in the book of Exodus. If you recall, Jacob and his family at the end of Genesis had traveled down into Egypt at the invitation of Jacob's son Joseph, who was working in a high capacity as a key leader in the nation of Egypt. And because of a famine all throughout the region, they had come for grain, and Joseph invited his father and his brothers and their families to all move to Egypt. Well, that's where the story of Exodus picks up. They are now living in Egypt. In fact, the first handful of sentences of Exodus pick up right there with the death of Joseph and listing off all the family of Joseph and Jacob and all his brothers, all their family who has moved to Egypt. And then it gives this line, "But then there arose in Egypt a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who had no regard for Joseph, no regard for Joseph's role in preserving Egypt during this great famine, and therefore had no regard for Joseph's family that was living in the northern part of Egypt. And from that point, the story of Exodus then fast forward to the days of Moses and his birth and his life, and to the story of Exodus, which in a nutshell, we'll give a little bit more of an overview here in a moment, but in a nutshell, the story of Exodus is how God raised up a deliverer by the name of Moses, how God challenged through Moses Pharaoh, who in Egyptian thinking is a very embodiment of God, their gods. And so you have this contest between Yahweh, the God of Moses and the Hebrews, and Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt that we know as the 10 plagues. And so you get that whole little contest in those 10 plagues. And then the rest of the story of Moses is how eventually Pharaoh finally relents, lets Israel go. They leave Egypt. Pharaoh chases them down. God parts the Red Sea. Israel passes through on dry land. Pharaoh and his army is swallowed up by the sea. And God delivers Israel out of the nation of Egypt, leads them to Mount Sinai, and then the rest of the book of Exodus takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai as God enters into covenant relationship with the family of Joseph and Jacob, the people of Israel. So that's how the whole story of Genesis and Exodus fit together. Now, a few key facts. The first is, who's the author of Exodus? Well, traditionally, the author has been identified as Moses, and certainly he is the key contributor to the book and the main character of the book, even if there might have been some parts of the book that were finished or completed by others, such as the account of Moses' death. I'm pretty sure he didn't write that bit himself. And what's the time period covered in the book of Exodus? Well, it picks up with the death of Joseph and very quickly summarizes that, lists off then all the people of Israel who came into Egypt with Jacob during Joseph's days. And then it goes all the way through the deliverance from Egypt to the formation of a covenant people at Mount Sinai. So that's the time period roughly covered in the book of Exodus. What's the date for the writing of the book of Exodus? Well, there are two main options for the date of both the Exodus event as well as the writing of the book. One is traditionally referred to as the late date, and that date is about 1250 BC. So the Exodus in the late date happens around 1250 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II. The other option is what's called the early date, and that date puts it at around 1446 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. Those are the options, and there are various scholarly reasons for each of those. I tend to lean towards the early date, the 1446 BC date, and that will be the way we approach the book here on the Listener's Commentary, but just know there are a couple options for that. And the Exodus, by just way of general description, the Exodus event that is recorded in the book of Exodus, where God delivers them out of Egypt, that is God's great act of redemption in the Old Testament. It's the foundation for the nation of Israel. God delivered them out of Egypt, entered into covenant relationship with them. And so they fled Egypt as a loosely connected band of kinsmen, and they leave Mount Sinai as a nation with a national charter and with national identity and a national set of laws and religious institutions. They leave Sinai as a nation in covenant relationship with God himself. That's the heart of the book of Exodus. So let me give a little more complete overview of the book so that you have sort of a lay of the land, a map as you read through it to try to sort out what's going on. And to begin with that overview, let me give you what I like to think of as like 4 pegs to hang the contents of Exodus on. Just 4 pegs that'll help you realize, okay, these are kind of the big markers in the story of the book of Exodus. So the first peg is the birth and early years of Moses. Those are the first handful of chapters of the book of Exodus, birth and early years of Moses. The second peg are the 10 plagues and the Exodus itself. So the 10 plagues and then Israel being led out of Egypt in the Exodus. The third peg is Mount Sinai and the 10 commandments. And then the fourth peg is God's presence and the tabernacle. Those are the 4 big chunks of the book of Exodus. So let's take them each one at a time, peg by peg, and hit a few of the details in each of those sections. So the first part is the birth and early years of Moses. And so in this section, you get Moses being born, but he's being born into an oppressed people whom the new leadership in Egypt despises and fears and wants to control the population so that they don't revolt and rise up against them. And so Moses is born into that situation, and as a result, he's put into a basket floated down the Nile River where Pharaoh's daughter, who is bathing in the river, discovers him. Moses then, for the first few years of his life, is actually cared for by his own mother, who serves as a wet nurse for him. So he grows up in Pharaoh's palace. He goes out, if you recall the story, to visit his own people, the Hebrews. He intervenes in a conflict. It leads to more tension, more conflict. And so Moses eventually flees Egypt for his life because Pharaoh wants to kill him. And he flees to the land of Midian, where he ends up staying with a family that becomes his own family. He marries the priest of Midian's daughter. Her name is Zipporah. And he becomes a shepherd for his father-in-law, caring for his sheep in the very region that he'll eventually be leading the people of Israel through. And so he doesn't know it yet, but his years of wandering this part of the world actually becomes training for leading as like the shepherd of the people of Israel through this very region. And so he's in that moment caring for the sheep when all of a sudden God appears to him in a burning bush, another familiar, famous story. And God calls Moses to be the deliverer of his own people back in Egypt. And so God preserves and prepares and appoints Moses to be Israel's deliverer. That's the first handful of chapters of the book of Exodus, the birth and early years of Moses. The second part, what I called peg number 2, is the 10 plagues and the Exodus. And so Moses goes back to Egypt from Midian. He confronts Pharaoh, which is really, as we noted, a conflict between God, the one true living God, and Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. That's what those 10 plagues are, and that then eventually leads to the Exodus, where the people of Israel leave Egypt. They are stuck at the Red Sea when God parts the Red Sea, leads them through on dry ground, leads them through the desert up to the foot of Mount Sinai. And all this region, remember, is familiar to Moses because he was wandering in this area taking care of sheep. And so God leads Israel through the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, and God defeats the gods of Egypt and sets Israel free. So that's the 10 plagues and the Exodus. The third part of the book of Exodus is Mount Sinai and the 10 commandments. And so Israel is camped at the base of Mount Sinai, and they're going to camp there for approximately 1 whole year. In fact, from Exodus 19 to Numbers chapter 10, Israel is camped at the base of Mount Sinai. And Moses is on Mount Sinai, and he receives the 10 Commandments, and he receives the covenant requirements for the nation of Israel. He comes down the mountain, he presents it to the people, and the people agree. They say that everything the Lord has commanded, we will do. And they agree to God's terms, and they enter into the covenant with a formal covenant ratifying ceremony, and God makes a covenant with Israel. They're going to be his people, and their whole purpose, according to Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, is they are to be a kingdom of priests among the nations who bring God's wisdom and God's truth into the world and reflect that to the nations around them. That's the whole purpose of the covenant. And so they are to carry forward, really, the promise that was made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and be a blessing for the nations as God's covenant people. So yes, they will be distinct from the nations, but they're distinct for the sake of the nations as a kingdom of priests. And so God makes a covenant with Israel, and Israel agrees to that covenant there at Mount Sinai. And then the fourth part, the fourth peg to hang the content of the book of Exodus on is God's presence and the tabernacle. And so what you get in really the whole last major section of the book of Exodus is the blueprints for the tabernacle and the building of the tabernacle. But here's how it works. God, beginning in chapter 25, lays out a very specific pattern for how he wants the tabernacle to be built. And then after those blueprints for the tabernacle, we get this little narrative that's an interruption into the whole tabernacle sequence. It's a very intentional moment where what happens is you get the golden calf moment. If you're familiar with your Bible, you know there's this moment where Moses has been on the mountain for a long time. Israel convinces Moses' brother Aaron, who's at the base of the mountain with the people, to fashion a golden calf or a golden bull that's going to represent God for them. And so you get that whole debacle with the golden calf. Moses comes down the mountain. He breaks the tablets in his frustration, seeing what happens. It leads to serious consequences. God threatens to not dwell among them and not go with them. Moses intercedes, pleads with God. It leads to God agreeing to go with them and a covenant renewal moment where, okay, God says, I will go with you, but there's going to have to be some changes. And then what you get in the rest of that is a record of the building of the whole tabernacle with lots of repetition from the blueprint chapters. And so that's sort of this long sequence from chapter 25 to the end of the book. You get all of that. Now, why is there so much space given to the tabernacle, to both the blueprints and the building of it? And how does that debacle with the golden calf fit into that? Well, we'll talk more about it when we get to those chapters in detail, but the key idea is God's presence. That's why I referred to peg number 4 as God's presence and the tabernacle. God's presence is what's going to distinguish Israel from the nations around them. And so as Moses is pleading with God after the golden calf incident, Moses says, if your presence doesn't go with us, what's going to make us any different than the other nations of the earth? And so we need to learn to think of the tabernacle as God's tent. That's what it is, both in reality and in function. Because you see, the people of Israel are living in tents as they've left Egypt, and now they're dwelling like nomads. Well, if God's going to dwell among them, and that's what God wants to do, he needs a tent. And so the tabernacle, the blueprints, are God giving instructions for what he wants his tent to be like. Then you have that whole debacle with the golden calf, and God's like, forget it. I can't live among this kind of people if that's the way it's going to be. Moses pleads with him, if your presence doesn't go with us, what's going to make us any different? So God agrees. The covenant is renewed, and then you get the building of the tabernacle, and then God's presence comes and fills the tabernacle. And so the tabernacle is God's tent that is going to move with them. right in the middle of them. Literally, in the way the whole camp is going to be set up, the tabernacle is going to be right in the middle, so God dwells in their midst. And all the rituals that describe how they are to use the tabernacle are meant to basically provide instructions for how to appropriately approach God and take care of his tent, since it's God's holy space. And so the main point of part 4 is that God enables Israel to build a tent for him so he can dwell among them. And in a nutshell, that's the book of Exodus. Now, the event of the Exodus becomes, in the Old Testament as well as in the New, a motif of God's redemption. It's a pattern or a template for God's redemption. And as Israel continues in their rebellion from the moment at Mount Sinai throughout their whole history recorded in the Old Testament, they continue in their rebellion against God. It leads to more idolatry during the time period of the kings. Then God sends his prophets, and as his prophets call Israel to account for their disloyalty to the covenant they made with God, the Exodus becomes this picture of really what God's going to do in the future. And so there's this hope for something like a second Exodus. It's going to be another great act of redemption that God's going to achieve. And that's the great redemption, the second Exodus that is achieved through Jesus in the New Testament. And so the Exodus becomes a key pattern for how God is going to deliver his people, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. So that's the book of Exodus in a nutshell. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the book of Exodus. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of people just like you, dozens and dozens of people who have been challenged, encouraged, built up by the Listener's Commentary and have joined the team of supporters. And if you want to join that team, the easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. You can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it a monthly recurring donation, you click a little box that says make this monthly, and all those monies then will come this way to help this ministry continue to grow and increase and reach more people so that they too can learn and live the Bible. Thanks a ton for your support.